When Captain Marcus Whitfield collapsed to his knees in the marble corridors of Kensington Palace, tears streaming down his weathered face, the youngest prince in the royal family knew he had to speak the truth that had haunted him for months. What Prince Edmund revealed that day would shake the very foundations of the royal household and expose a web of secrets that had been carefully hidden behind palace walls. This is the story of courage, fear, and the unlikely bond between a 7-year-old prince and the man sworn to protect him, a bond that would ultimately save them both from a darkness that threatened to consume the royal family from within. The morning sun cast long shadows through the ornate windows of Kensington Palace as Captain Marcus Whitfield made his usual rounds through the royal quarters. For 15 years, he had served as the head of the Royal Protection Unit, a man whose dedication to the crown was legendary among his peers. His broad shoulders had carried the weight of protecting the most important family in the nation, and his steel-blue eyes had never shown weakness until today. Prince Edmund, barely 7 years old with sandy brown hair and curious green eyes, had been trailing behind the captain as he often did during morning security checks. The young prince found comfort in the routine, in the steady presence of the man who had become something of a father figure to him since his own father had grown increasingly distant following his remarriage to Lady Charlotte Pemberton. Lady Charlotte had brought her own children into the royal household, twins Victoria and Alexander, both 12 years old, who carried themselves with an air of superiority that made Edmund's stomach twist with anxiety. Their mother, now the new queen consort, had quickly established herself as a formidable presence in the palace, her sharp wit and calculating nature earning her both admirers and enemies among the court. As they walked past the portrait gallery, Edmund noticed that Captain Whitfield's usual steady gait had become irregular. The man's hands, which typically remained relaxed at his sides, were now clenched into tight fists. His breathing had grown shallow, and a thin layer of perspiration had formed on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "Captain," Edmund's small voice echoed in the vast corridor. "Are you feeling unwell?" Whitfield stopped abruptly, his back rigid. For a moment, he remained perfectly still, as if fighting some internal battle. Then, without warning, his knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The sound of his fall reverberated through the hallway like a gunshot. Edmund rushed to his side, his small hands reaching out to touch the captain's shoulder. "Captain Whitfield, what's wrong? Should I call for help?" Through his tears, which now flowed freely down his cheeks, Whitfield looked up at the young prince. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "Your Highness, I cannot protect you from what's happening in your own home." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Edmund was too young to fully understand but old enough to sense the gravity of. He had noticed things, the way Victoria and Alexander looked at him when the adults weren't watching, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room, the bruises on his arms that he couldn't quite remember getting. "What do you mean?" Edmund asked, settling down beside the captain on the floor, his royal protocol forgotten in the face of his protector's distress. Whitfield wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, trying to compose himself. But the dam had broken, and 15 years of maintaining professional composure in the face of increasing concern for the young prince's welfare came pouring out. "I've been watching, Your Highness. I've been documenting everything. The way they treat you when the cameras aren't rolling, the way your stepmother looks the other way when her children." He paused, unable to finish the sentence. Edmund's face paled as understanding began to dawn. The games Victoria and Alexander played with him weren't really games at all. The times they locked him in the old servants' quarters and told him monsters lived there weren't just typical sibling pranks. The food they sometimes convinced him was special prince food that made him sick to his stomach wasn't a treat at all. "They said if I told anyone, something terrible would happen to you," Edmund whispered, his own eyes beginning to fill with tears. "Victoria said that if I was a tattletale, Captain Whitfield might have an accident like what happened to Captain Reynolds." Whitfield's blood ran cold. Captain Reynolds had been his predecessor, a good man who had died in what was officially ruled a car accident, but had always seemed suspicious to those who knew him well. Reynolds had been asking questions about the treatment of royal children in his final weeks, expressing concerns to his superiors about what he had observed. "Your Highness," Whitfield said, taking the young prince's hands in his own. "I need you to tell me everything. Every single thing they've done to you, every threat they've made. Can you be brave enough to do that?" Edmund looked down the long corridor toward the family wing of the palace, where he knew Victoria and Alexander were likely planning their next game for him. His stepmother would be in her morning meeting with the palace staff, wielding her influence like a weapon to ensure her version of events was always the one that reached his father's ears. "I'm scared, Captain," he admitted, his voice small and vulnerable. "But I'm more scared of what happens if I don't tell someone. Last night, Alexander showed me pictures of other children who had accidents when they didn't follow the rules. He said I could be next if I wasn't careful." The captain's jaw tightened as rage built within him. These weren't just typical childhood bullying incidents. This was systematic psychological torture being inflicted on a 7-year-old boy by children who had been taught to see him as an obstacle to their mother's complete control over the royal household. "We're going to fix this," Whitfield promised, though he knew the challenges ahead were immense. "But first, we need to get you somewhere safe while we figure out how to approach this properly." As they sat together on the marble floor, Prince and Protector, they both understood that this moment would change everything. The truth Edmund was about to reveal would expose a carefully constructed web of manipulation and abuse that reached into the highest levels of the royal household. But it would also begin the process of healing for a young boy who had been suffering in silence, protected only by a man who refused to let his duty be defined by palace politics. The afternoon brought new challenges as word spread through the palace staff that something significant had occurred in the East Wing. Lady Charlotte's network of loyal servants began to mobilize, gathering information and preparing damage control measures. The Queen Consort had not achieved her position through luck alone. She was a master manipulator who had contingency plans for every possible threat to her family's standing. Edmund found himself in the captain's private office, a small but comfortable room adjacent to the security center. For the first time in months, he felt truly safe as he began to recount the experiences that had been plaguing him since his father's remarriage. Each revelation painted a picture of calculated cruelty designed to break his spirit and remove him as a potential threat to Victoria and Alexander's inheritance claims. The psychological warfare had been subtle at first, small acts of sabotage that made Edmund appear clumsy or forgetful in front of his father and the palace staff. Books disappeared from his room only to be found in inappropriate places, making him seem irresponsible. His homework assignments were tampered with, creating the impression that he was struggling academically. Personal items went missing, leading to accusations that he was careless with his belongings. As Lady Charlotte's influence in the household grew stronger, the attacks became more direct. Victoria and Alexander had developed an elaborate system of rewards and punishments, convincing Edmund that their mother possessed supernatural powers that allowed her to know everything that happened in the palace. They told him stories of previous royal children who had mysteriously disappeared when they caused too much trouble, showing him doctored photographs and false historical accounts that seemed to support their claims. The physical intimidation had escalated gradually. What started as accidental bumps and shoves during family gatherings evolved into more deliberate acts of violence when they could ensure privacy. The twins had learned to target areas where bruises wouldn't be visible in formal photographs: the ribs, the back, the upper arms where sleeves would provide coverage. Captain Whitfield listened to each account with growing horror and determination. As a trained security professional, he recognized the sophisticated nature of the psychological manipulation being employed. This wasn't random cruelty. It was a calculated campaign designed to isolate Edmund from potential support systems and establish complete control over his behavior. The most disturbing revelations centered around the systematic campaign to turn palace staff against the young prince. Lady Charlotte had skillfully positioned herself as a concerned stepmother dealing with a troubled child, sharing carefully crafted stories about Edmund's supposed behavioral problems with key personnel. She painted a picture of a boy struggling to adjust to his new family situation, acting out in ways that required firm discipline and careful management. The twins had been coached to support their mother's narrative, providing evidence of Edmund's alleged misconduct to staff members who were positioned to report back to his father. They created elaborate scenarios where Edmund appeared to be lying, stealing, or behaving inappropriately, always ensuring that witnesses were present to confirm their version of events. This manipulation extended to Edmund's relationship with his father, the king. Lady Charlotte had gradually positioned herself as the primary source of information about the children's daily activities, filtering every report through her own agenda. She presented Victoria and Alexander as model children who were struggling to bond with their new stepbrother, while portraying Edmund as a difficult child who required constant supervision and correction. The psychological impact on Edmund had been devastating. At 7 years old, he lacked the cognitive tools to understand that he was being systematically gaslit and manipulated. He began to doubt his own perceptions and memories, wondering if he really was as problematic as everyone seemed to believe. The isolation from his father, combined with the constant threat of violence from his step-siblings, had created a perfect storm of anxiety and fear that affected every aspect of his daily life. As evening approached, Captain Whitfield found himself facing the most difficult decision of his career. He possessed detailed documentation of suspicious incidents, witness statements from concerned staff members, and now Edmund's first-hand account of ongoing abuse. But he also understood the political realities of confronting the Queen Consort with such serious allegations. Lady Charlotte had spent considerable time and effort building relationships with influential members of Parliament, media executives, and foreign dignitaries. Her public image as a devoted stepmother and modernizing influence on the royal family was carefully maintained through strategic charitable work and media appearances. Any accusations against her would be met with fierce resistance from her extensive network of allies. The captain's own position was precarious as well. His predecessor's suspicious death served as a clear warning about the consequences of becoming too troublesome for the wrong people. But as he looked at Edmund, who had finally fallen asleep in a chair beside his desk after hours of emotional testimony, Whitfield knew he had no choice but to act on the information he had gathered. The first step would be securing additional protection for Edmund while building an airtight case against his tormentors. This meant reaching out to trusted contacts outside the immediate palace hierarchy, individuals who had the authority and motivation to investigate serious allegations against members of the royal household. The process would be dangerous and politically complex, but the alternative, allowing a 7-year-old boy to continue suffering in silence, was unthinkable. As night fell over Kensington Palace, Captain Marcus Whitfield began making the phone calls that would either save Prince Edmund or destroy them both. The battle for the soul of the royal family was about to begin, and the stakes could not have been higher. Secrets in the shadows. The dawn of the second day brought an eerie calm to Kensington Palace, the kind of stillness that typically preceded major storms. Captain Whitfield had spent the night in his office, alternating between making secure phone calls to trusted contacts and watching over Prince Edmund, who slept fitfully in the adjoining rest area. The young prince's dreams were troubled, filled with whispered threats and shadowy figures that seemed to follow him through endless palace corridors. At precisely 6 in the morning, Whitfield's secure telephone rang with the distinctive tone reserved for priority communications. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell of the Metropolitan Police's Royal Protection Command was calling with news that would change the trajectory of their investigation. "Marcus, we've uncovered some disturbing information about Lady Charlotte's background." Mitchell's voice was tight with urgency. "It appears her credentials for entering the royal family were not as thoroughly vetted as protocol would typically require. There are gaps in her history that raise serious questions about her motivations." Whitfield listened carefully as Mitchell outlined the findings of her overnight investigation. Lady Charlotte Pemberton had not been born into nobility, as her official biography suggested. Instead, she had constructed an elaborate false identity that traced back nearly 15 years, complete with forged documents and carefully planted references that had fooled even the royal security services. Her real name was Charlotte Blackwood, and she had grown up in a working-class family in Manchester. Her transformation into Lady Pemberton had been methodical and patient, involving years of preparation that included accent coaching, etiquette training, and the systematic cultivation of relationships with minor aristocrats who could provide legitimacy for her fabricated background. Most concerning of all, Detective Inspector Mitchell had discovered that Charlotte Blackwood had previously been investigated in connection with suspicious incidents involving wealthy elderly individuals who had made significant changes to their wills shortly before their deaths. While no charges had ever been filed, the pattern was troubling enough to warrant serious investigation. "She's not just an opportunist, Marcus," Mitchell explained. "This woman is a professional predator who has spent decades perfecting the art of infiltrating and manipulating wealthy families." The royal marriage wasn't a stroke of luck. It was the culmination of a carefully planned campaign. As Whitfield absorbed this information, Prince Edmund stirred in his sleep, murmuring words that made the captain's blood run cold. Even in his dreams, the young prince was apologizing for imagined transgressions, begging unseen tormentors not to hurt Captain Whitfield, promising to be better if they would just leave him alone. The revelation about Lady Charlotte's true identity provided crucial context for understanding the sophisticated nature of the psychological warfare being waged against Edmund. This wasn't the impulsive cruelty of spoiled children. It was part of a calculated strategy to eliminate potential obstacles to Charlotte's ultimate goal of controlling the royal family's wealth and influence. Mitchell continued her briefing, explaining that Victoria and Alexander were not Charlotte's biological children either. They had been adopted from a private agency that specialized in placing children with families who could provide them with enhanced opportunities. The adoption records had been sealed, but preliminary investigations suggested that both children had been selected based on specific psychological profiles that indicated high intelligence combined with malleable moral structures. "She's been training them since they were very young," Mitchell revealed. "We've spoken with former neighbors and teachers who described the children as unusually disciplined and mature for their ages. Several people mentioned that they seemed to be constantly performing, as if they were always being evaluated on their behavior." This information cast Edmund's experiences in an even more sinister light. Victoria and Alexander weren't simply jealous step-siblings acting out their frustrations. They were trained operatives in their adoptive mother's long-term plan to seize control of the royal household. Every cruel game, every psychological manipulation, every threat had been designed to achieve specific objectives in Charlotte's overall strategy. The morning brought new challenges as palace staff began to notice Edmund's absence from his usual routines. His private tutor, Miss Elizabeth Hartwell, arrived for their scheduled lesson only to discover that the young prince was nowhere to be found. When she inquired with the household staff, she was told that he had been feeling unwell and was resting under medical supervision. Lady Charlotte moved quickly to control the narrative surrounding Edmund's disappearance from public view. She personally met with Miss Hartwell to express her concern about the young prince's recent behavioral changes, describing incidents of mood swings, academic difficulties, and social withdrawal that suggested he might be experiencing psychological distress. "I'm afraid Edmund has been struggling more than we initially realized," Charlotte explained to the tutor with perfectly performed maternal concern. "His father and I have decided that he needs some time away from his regular schedule to work with specialists who can help him process his feelings about our family situation." Miss Hartwell, who had been working with Edmund for over 2 years, found this explanation troubling. In her experience, the young prince had been a bright, eager student who showed no signs of the behavioral problems Lady Charlotte was describing. If anything, she had noticed that Edmund seemed increasingly anxious and withdrawn only after his father's remarriage, not before. But Miss Hartwell also understood the precarious nature of her position as a palace employee. Questioning the word of the queen consort could result in immediate termination and blacklisting from future royal service positions. She nodded politely and accepted the explanation, though privately she resolved to document her concerns in her personal records. Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Mitchell was working to establish a secure communication network that could operate independently of normal palace channels. The investigation had revealed that Lady Charlotte had systematically placed her allies in key positions throughout the royal household staff, creating an extensive surveillance and influence network that monitored virtually every aspect of daily palace life. Head butler James Morrison had been replaced 6 months after Charlotte's arrival, ostensibly due to his difficulty adapting to new family dynamics. His replacement, Thomas Ashford, had impeccable references but no verifiable work history prior to joining the royal staff. Kitchen staff, housekeepers, and even junior security personnel had been gradually replaced with individuals whose backgrounds showed subtle connections to Charlotte's network of associates. The scope of the infiltration was breathtaking in its thoroughness. Charlotte had essentially conducted a silent coup within the palace hierarchy, positioning her people in roles where they could monitor communications, control information flow, and report on the activities of family members and remaining loyal staff. Captain Whitfield realized that his own communications had likely been monitored from the beginning. Every phone call, every email, every written report had probably been intercepted and analyzed by Charlotte's network. The fact that he had been allowed to continue his investigation suggested that she was confident in her ability to neutralize any threat he might pose. This revelation forced a complete reassessment of their security protocols. Any evidence they had gathered could be compromised. Any plans they had made could be known to their adversaries, and any allies they thought they had among the palace staff could actually be working for Charlotte. Prince Edmund woke from his troubled sleep to find Captain Whitfield deep in conversation with a woman he didn't recognize. Detective Inspector Mitchell had arrived at the palace under the cover of conducting a routine security assessment, but her real purpose was to interview Edmund in a more formal capacity and begin documenting evidence that could be used in potential legal proceedings. "Your Highness," Whitfield said gently as Edmund rubbed his eyes and tried to orient himself. "This is Detective Inspector Mitchell. She's here to help us make sure you're safe." Mitchell approached the young prince with the careful demeanor of someone experienced in interviewing traumatized children. She understood that Edmund's testimony would be crucial to any case they might build against Charlotte and her children, but she also recognized that pushing too hard too fast could re-traumatize him or cause him to withdraw completely. "Hello, Edmund," she said, settling into a chair at his eye level. "Captain Whitfield has told me that some people have been treating you unkindly. I'd like to hear about that from you, but only if you're feeling ready to talk about it." Edmund looked nervously between the detective and Captain Whitfield, still processing the events of the previous day. The safety he had felt in revealing his experiences was now tempered by a growing understanding that speaking out had set powerful forces in motion. "Will my father be angry with me?" he asked quietly. "Victoria said that if I ever told stories about our family, it would make him very sad and might make him sick like grandfather was before he died." Mitchell exchanged a significant look with Captain Whitfield. The reference to Edmund's grandfather's death was particularly troubling, as the former king had indeed died unexpectedly while Charlotte was positioning herself to marry his son. The official cause of death had been listed as heart failure, but given what they now knew about Charlotte's history, even that seemingly natural death deserved renewed investigation. "Your father loves you very much," Mitchell assured Edmund. "Sometimes adults make mistakes because they don't have all the information they need to make good decisions. By telling us what's been happening, you're helping us give your father the information he needs to protect you and make things better." Over the next several hours, Mitchell conducted a careful interview that revealed the full extent of the psychological and physical abuse Edmund had endured. She used specialized techniques designed to help children recall traumatic events without being re-traumatized, allowing Edmund to tell his story at his own pace, while ensuring that his testimony would be admissible in any future legal proceedings. The picture that emerged was even more disturbing than their initial assessment had suggested. Charlotte and her children had not only been tormenting Edmund directly but had been systematically undermining his relationships with everyone around him. They had intercepted letters from his maternal grandmother, convincing him that she no longer wanted to see him. They had sabotaged friendships with other royal children by spreading false stories about Edmund's behavior at social events. Most insidiously, they had been gradually poisoning his relationship with his father by ensuring that every interaction between them occurred under circumstances that made Edmund appear problematic or disrespectful. Charlotte had coached Victoria and Alexander to create disturbances during family time that would be blamed on Edmund's supposed behavioral issues. The twins had even been trained to inflict injuries on themselves that could be blamed on their stepbrother, creating a documented history of violence that supported Charlotte's narrative about Edmund's dangerous psychological state. Medical records showed multiple incidents where Victoria or Alexander had sought treatment for injuries that they claimed Edmund had inflicted during unprovoked attacks. As the afternoon progressed, Detective Inspector Mitchell began to understand that they were dealing with a criminal conspiracy that went far beyond simple child abuse. Charlotte Blackwood had orchestrated a comprehensive campaign to eliminate Prince Edmund as a potential heir to the throne while simultaneously positioning her adopted children as worthy successors. The psychological torture was just one component of a larger plan that likely included forged documents, bribed officials, and possibly even murder. The investigation was expanding rapidly as Mitchell's team uncovered additional evidence of Charlotte's criminal network. Financial records showed suspicious transactions that suggested bribery and money laundering on an international scale. Communication intercepts revealed conversations with individuals who specialized in document forgery and identity theft. Most alarmingly, surveillance footage from various locations showed meetings between Charlotte's associates and individuals known to be involved in organized crime activities. As evening approached, Captain Whitfield faced a terrible realization. They were running out of time. Charlotte's network had undoubtedly detected the unusual activity surrounding Edmund's disappearance from normal routines. If they didn't act quickly to secure additional protection for the young prince and present their evidence to appropriate authorities, they might find themselves facing much more serious threats than bureaucratic resistance. The battle for Prince Edmund's safety was about to escalate into a full-scale war for the soul of the monarchy itself. Charlotte Blackwood had spent years positioning herself for this moment, and she would not surrender her prize without using every weapon at her disposal. The question now was whether Captain Whitfield and Detective Inspector Mitchell could move fast enough to save Edmund before Charlotte decided that eliminating him permanently was her only remaining option. The web of deception the third day dawned with an oppressive atmosphere that seemed to permeate every corner of Kensington Palace. Detective Inspector Mitchell had worked through the night with her specialized team, assembling evidence that painted an increasingly horrifying picture of Charlotte Blackwood's criminal enterprise. What had initially appeared to be a case of domestic abuse had evolved into something far more sinister, a sophisticated criminal conspiracy that threatened the very foundation of the British monarchy. Prince Edmund remained under protective custody in Captain Whitfield's secure quarters, but both men understood that their sanctuary was temporary at best. Charlotte's network of informants throughout the palace meant that their location and activities were likely being monitored continuously. The question was no longer whether Charlotte knew about their investigation, but rather when she would decide to take decisive action to eliminate the threat they posed. At dawn, Detective Inspector Mitchell received an encrypted communication from her supervisor at New Scotland Yard that would change the entire trajectory of their investigation. Commissioner Robert Ashworth had received intelligence from MI5 suggesting that Charlotte Blackwood's criminal activities extended far beyond financial fraud and child abuse. She was suspected of being a key operative in an international conspiracy designed to destabilize European monarchies through infiltration and manipulation. "Marcus, we're dealing with something much larger than we initially understood," Mitchell explained during a secure video conference that included Commissioner Ashworth and representatives from MI5. Charlotte Blackwood appears to be part of a coordinated effort to undermine legitimate royal succession across multiple countries. The intelligence briefing revealed that similar operations had been detected in Norway, Sweden, and Belgium, where attractive and apparently well-connected women had married into royal or noble families only to begin systematic campaigns against existing heirs. In each case, mysterious accidents, scandals, or psychological breakdowns had eliminated potential successors to important titles and positions, clearing the way for the infiltrators' chosen candidates. The pattern was consistent and sophisticated. The female operatives would spend years establishing credible backgrounds and cultivating relationships that would grant them access to their targets. Once married or positioned within the family structure, they would begin methodical campaigns to eliminate threats to their children's inheritance prospects. The psychological warfare tactics being employed against Prince Edmund matched documented strategies used in at least 3 other countries. Commissioner Ashworth's briefing included classified intelligence about Charlotte's true controllers, a shadowy organization with connections to organized crime syndicates, foreign intelligence services, and corrupt business interests. The ultimate goal appeared to be gaining influence over European royal families that could be leveraged for financial gain, political manipulation, and access to classified information. The targeting of Prince Edmund isn't just about securing inheritance rights, explained Agent Sarah Collins from MI5. His eventual position in the line of succession would provide Charlotte's handlers with access to state secrets, diplomatic communications, and financial intelligence that could be worth hundreds of millions of pounds. This revelation cast Edmund's suffering in an even more disturbing light. The 7-year-old prince wasn't just the victim of domestic abuse. He was a target in an international conspiracy that viewed him as an obstacle to be eliminated by any means necessary. The psychological torture he had endured was designed not only to break his spirit, but also to create a documented history of mental instability that could justify more extreme measures if other approaches failed. Captain Whitfield absorbed this information with growing alarm. His protective instincts, honed through years of royal security service, told him that they had moved beyond the realm of conventional law enforcement. Charlotte Blackwood and her associates were operating at a level of sophistication that suggested state-sponsored resources and training. Confronting such an adversary through normal channels would likely result in their evidence being suppressed and their witnesses eliminated. Meanwhile, within the palace, Charlotte was orchestrating her own response to the growing threat posed by Captain Whitfield's investigation. Her network of informants had provided detailed intelligence about the overnight activities, including the arrival of Detective Inspector Mitchell and the involvement of additional security personnel. Charlotte understood that she was facing a critical decision point that would determine the success or failure of her years-long operation. Victoria and Alexander had been summoned to their mother's private study for an emergency briefing. At 12 years old, both children possessed intelligence and training that far exceeded their chronological age. Charlotte had been preparing them for exactly this scenario since their adoption, drilling them in techniques for managing crisis situations and eliminating threats to their family's position. Children, we are facing a challenge that will test everything we have learned together, Charlotte explained with the calm authority of a military commander briefing her troops. Captain Whitfield and his associates are attempting to interfere with our family's happiness and security. We must respond appropriately to protect ourselves and our future. The twins listened with the focused attention of seasoned operatives receiving mission orders. They had been trained to view any threats to their family's position as existential challenges that required decisive action. Prince Edmund was not their stepbrother. He was an enemy combatant who threatened their survival and success. Charlotte outlined a comprehensive strategy for neutralizing the immediate threat while positioning themselves for long-term victory. The plan included elements of misdirection, character assassination, and, if necessary, more direct forms of elimination. Victoria and Alexander would play crucial roles in implementing each phase of the operation. The first objective was discrediting Captain Whitfield's credibility by exposing what Charlotte termed his inappropriate relationship with Prince Edmund. Her intelligence network had been documenting every interaction between the captain and the young prince, carefully editing footage and communications to suggest improper conduct. If presented skillfully, this evidence could transform Whitfield from protector to predator in the eyes of palace administrators and the general public. Simultaneously, Charlotte would activate her network of allies within the palace staff to corroborate a new narrative about Prince Edmund's psychological state. The young prince would be portrayed as a deeply disturbed child who had developed an unhealthy obsession with Captain Whitfield and was now fabricating elaborate stories to maintain the man's attention and affection. Victoria and Alexander had specific assignments in supporting this narrative. They would provide testimony about their stepbrother's supposed history of lying and manipulation, describing incidents where he had invented stories about being mistreated in order to gain sympathy from adults. Their performances would be crucial in convincing skeptical observers that Edmund's allegations were the product of a troubled imagination rather than genuine abuse. The twins had been rehearsing these performances for months, perfecting their ability to display convincing emotions while delivering carefully scripted accounts of fabricated events. Their training included techniques for maintaining consistency under questioning, managing their body language to appear truthful, and coordinating their stories to eliminate contradictions. If the initial strategy failed to neutralize the threat, Charlotte had prepared more extreme measures. Her criminal network included individuals with expertise in staging accidents, administering untraceable poisons, and eliminating witnesses who posed threats to ongoing operations. Captain Whitfield, Detective Inspector Mitchell, and potentially even Prince Edmund himself could be eliminated if they could not be discredited through other means. The afternoon brought the first implementation of Charlotte's counterattack strategy. Palace Administrator Geoffrey Thornton, a man whose loyalty Charlotte had secured through a combination of bribery and blackmail, requested an urgent meeting with Detective Inspector Mitchell and Captain Whitfield. Thornton claimed to have received disturbing allegations about the captain's conduct that required immediate investigation. "I'm afraid we've received some very serious complaints about Captain Whitfield's behavior with Prince Edmund," Thornton explained with perfectly performed concern. "Multiple staff members have reported observing inappropriate interactions that suggest the captain may have developed an unhealthy attachment to the young prince." Mitchell immediately recognized the coordinated nature of the allegations. The timing was too convenient, the witnesses too conveniently placed, and the accusations too perfectly designed to undermine their investigation. She had encountered similar tactics during previous cases involving organized criminal enterprises, where character assassination was employed as the first line of defense against law enforcement pressure. "I'd like to interview these staff members individually and review any documentation they can provide," Mitchell responded professionally. "These are serious allegations that deserve thorough investigation through proper channels." Thornton's discomfort with this response was subtle but noticeable to Mitchell's trained eye. He had clearly expected the allegations alone to be sufficient for suspending Captain Whitfield and ending their investigation. The prospect of subjecting his witnesses to detailed questioning by an experienced detective was obviously not part of the plan Charlotte had provided. Meanwhile, Prince Edmund was struggling with the emotional aftermath of his revelations and the growing understanding that his decision to speak out had set powerful forces in motion. The safety he had felt in Captain Whitfield's protection was being overshadowed by anxiety about what would happen to the man who had shown him kindness when everyone else had turned away. "Captain, am I causing trouble for you?" Edmund asked during one of their quiet conversations. "Victoria used to tell me that caring about me would make people sad and might hurt them. I don't want you to be hurt because you try to help me." Whitfield knelt down to meet the young prince's eyes, understanding that this conversation would be crucial for Edmund's emotional recovery regardless of what happened to their investigation. "Your Highness, helping you isn't causing me trouble. It's the most important thing I've ever done. Some people might try to make things difficult for us, but that's because they're afraid of what happens when the truth comes out." The captain's words carried more weight than Edmund could fully understand. Whitfield had made a conscious decision to prioritize the young prince's welfare over his own career security, understanding that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal consequences. His years of loyal service to the crown had prepared him for this moment, when duty and conscience aligned to demand action despite the risks involved. As evening approached, Detective Inspector Mitchell received intelligence that confirmed their worst fears about Charlotte's escalation plans. Intercepted communications suggested that if the character assassination strategy failed to neutralize their investigation, more direct measures would be implemented within the next 48 hours. The criminal network backing Charlotte had resources and connections that extended throughout the British government and security services. They had successfully eliminated threats in other countries without facing serious consequences, and they had no reason to believe that the United Kingdom would prove more challenging. The death of Captain Whitfield's predecessor had demonstrated their willingness and ability to remove obstacles through violence when necessary. Mitchell understood that they were rapidly approaching a point of no return. Within hours, they would need to either present their evidence to authorities with sufficient power to protect them and pursue justice, or they would need to implement emergency protocols for protecting Prince Edmund through alternative means. The traditional channels of law enforcement and palace administration had been too thoroughly compromised by Charlotte's network to provide reliable protection. The question now was whether they could move fast enough to save Edmund and expose Charlotte's conspiracy before her criminal associates decided that eliminating all the witnesses was the most efficient solution to their problem. The next 24 hours would determine whether a 7-year-old prince would be rescued from his tormentors or become another casualty in an international conspiracy that viewed human lives as expendable obstacles to profit and power. Captain Marcus Whitfield spent that evening writing detailed reports that documented every aspect of their investigation, understanding that these records might be the only evidence that survived if their enemies succeeded in eliminating them. His duty to protect Prince Edmund had evolved into something much larger, a responsibility to expose a threat that endangered not just one young boy, but the entire institution of constitutional monarchy that he had sworn to defend. The battle for Edmund's life had become a war for the soul of the crown itself, and the outcome would determine whether justice or conspiracy would ultimately prevail within the walls of Kensington Palace. The royal reckoning the fourth day brought an atmosphere of barely contained crisis that permeated every level of Kensington Palace. Captain Whitfield had spent the pre-dawn hours implementing emergency security protocols he had hoped never to use, while Detective Inspector Mitchell coordinated with specialized units from both MI5 and the Metropolitan Police's Counterterrorism Command. The investigation into Prince Edmund's abuse had evolved into a national security operation targeting what appeared to be an international conspiracy against the British crown. Prince Edmund woke to find his protective sanctuary transformed into something resembling a military command center. Secure communication equipment hummed quietly in corners while plainclothes officers maintained watch positions that provided clear sight lines to all approaches. Despite the obvious tension among the adults, Edmund felt safer than he had in months, surrounded by people who were clearly dedicated to protecting him from the forces that had made his life a nightmare. At precisely 7 in the morning, Commissioner Ashworth arrived at the palace with authorization from the Home Secretary to conduct a comprehensive investigation into security breaches affecting the royal family. His presence triggered immediate alarm throughout Charlotte's network of informants.